in this tutorial is demystify the half square triangle. It's a very simple concept, but sometimes it can be difficult to get our half square triangle units accurate. So I'm going to show you the concept of a half square triangle. In our first lesson, we talked about half square triangles starting as squares. So if you take a square and you cut it in half on the diagonal, you get 2 patches. So both of these, you would get 2 patches. And this is called a half square triangle patch, and this is a half square triangle patch. And when you sew them together, you have a half square triangle unit. So you can see that if you want 2 half square triangle units, you need 2 different squares to start off with. You cut each one in half diagonally, then you put the 2 different fabrics together and you get 2 squares. So keep this concept in mind when we look at this. If we take in its simplest form a half square triangle, to get this half square triangle units, you would need to add 7/8 of an inch to your finished size. So the 2-inch finished size would be cut at 2 7/8 inches. And 7/8 inches is very difficult to get accurately and consistently. There is this ruler from Creative Grids called Simple 7/8, and it measures a perfect 7/8 inch. So you have 7/8 inch marking, 1 7/8, 2 7/8, 3 7/8, 4 7/8. You can use this to cut accurate squares for your half square triangles if that's what you want to do. But a lot of times if you do it that way and then you take these and cut them in half on the diagonal like this, if you're just going to do one set of half square triangles, you'll take each of these fabrics, cut them in half on the diagonal like this, and then you would sew these together. You flip this over, match all 3 sides, and then you would stitch a 1/4 inch. After we sew these together, you press, and I press these open. Now we're going to measure. These should now measure 2.5 inches, and we have the little nubs we need to cut off, but we'll do that later. So let's start measuring this one, and it should be 2.5 inches, and it is slightly off. See, this is 2.5 here and here, and this is off. It's about 1/8 of an inch, maybe, yeah, about 1/8 of an inch. So I would trim that off. And it all happens because the seam allowance maybe is not right. See, this one is a little bit smaller, so it made the finished product larger. Now let's measure this one. And this one is pretty close to perfect. So it's 2.5 here, 2.5 here, and on these sides. So I would trim off these nubs on both of them. I would trim this down to 2.5 and trim off the nubs. Sometimes you're not as lucky. Sometimes they come out smaller, but the point I want to try to make is normally you don't have consistency when you do it this way. So the next method is to make 2 at a time half square triangles. You cut the squares to the same size, and in this case these are cut to 2 7/8 inches. But what I would do is cut it at 3 inches, add a little bit extra, and trim it down later. But what I'm going to do with this one, since I've cut it 2 7/8 inches, then I've drawn my diagonal line, and I'm going to stitch on both sides of this diagonal line. Now here I've sewn a scant 1/4 inch. That means it's not a full 1/4 inch from the drawn line to the stitching line. And I did this because if it's larger, I can always trim it. But if it's smaller, I'll have to rip it out and do it again. I'm going to cut on this diagonal line and then press it. Now this is my second set that I made with using 2 squares and cutting the squares in half. So now we're going to measure these and see how accurate they are. They should also measure 2.5 inches. And what I did for this one, I used the scant 1/4 inch, so I expect it to be a little bit bigger. You want to line this up, the diagonal, so that it goes right where the 2 fabrics meet, here and here. So I can see that I've got 2.5 inches here, and I'm going to move this up slightly because I don't have it at the bottom. So I see now I need to trim off some here. This is fine, and this needs to be evened up. So I'll do that. Then you flip this around, line it up again, and trim. So we'll line up the 2.5. Wants to move on this mat. So we line up the 2.5 here and down here. In this angle, then we'll trim. Not too much to be trimmed off, but there's some. So now we have this will be our 2-inch finished half square triangle. And we'll do the same thing over here. Let's check our accuracy. Now this needs to be moved up. And see, now I have almost exactly here and almost there. So I'm just going to trim. Not very much. But I'm really close on this. Should have had a little bit more. And then we'll trim this. Okay. So these 4 we just did were made, and they were cut to the exact size you need, the 2 7/8 inch square. But what I'm going to recommend, if you're having trouble with that, then cut the squares larger, and in this case we would cut them 3 inches, and you know you're going to have to trim down, and then there's extra space you have to trim. So you can download, and you'll see the link in the description below the video. This is for half square triangles 2 at a time. Here's your finished size, your unfinished size. This is what you would trim it to. And these are the sizes you cut the squares. So I recommend, if you're having trouble, either cutting the 2 7/8 inch or sewing the 2 7/8 inch, bump it up to the next one, the 3 inches. So here would be the 2-inch finished. The unfinished size is 2.5 inches, and you cut the 2 squares each at 3 inches. Now this is fine. If you do the half square triangles 2 at a time is fine if you don't need a lot of half square triangles. What if you needed 200 half square triangles? This would be a lot of cutting and a lot of trimming. So I would suggest in that case you use half square triangles 8 at a time. For half square triangles 8 at a time, you cut 2 large squares. You cut 1 large light square and 1 large dark square. And what it comes down to is these are the half square triangles 2 at a time, the same size we cut before. And if you put these 4 together like this, you see these are our diagonal lines have now met, and so it's a big X. Then we cut them apart on between the squares, so like this. Next we will cut on the diagonal lines, and we'll have our 8 half square triangles. So watch this short little tutorial on how to make half square triangles 8 at a time. We'll take the light fabric, and on the back we're going to draw some lines. First we're going to draw diagonal lines across the diagonal, and both of them, that's 2 lines. The next line will be a vertical line down the middle and a horizontal line down the middle. Take these fabrics and put them right sides together, match up all the sides. We're going to stitch 1/4 inch on each side of the diagonal lines. So you'll have 2 lines of stitching here, you turn it, and then you'll have 2 lines of stitching here. We've done our stitching on both sides of each diagonal line. Here's what it looks like from the back. Now we're going to cut every line that we drew. So it's 4 different lines, and we'll cut each line. Now we open them up, and we have our half square triangle. We're going to press these open and then trim them. Included on the same sheet you can download for half square triangles 2 at a time is a chart for half square triangles 8 at a time. Gives you the finished size, the unfinished size, and the size to cut the squares. If we take this concept of the two fabrics to make 2 half-square triangles at a time, and we put 4 of them together to make 8 half-square triangles at a time, we can just start multiplying these squares. And we can have rows across and rows down and make however many triangles you need at once. And we do this with triangle papers. This is a sample of a brand called Triangles on a Roll. It is a thin paper that comes on a long roll. You cut off the amount you need for your project, and you cut 2 pieces of fabric slightly larger than the size of the paper you cut. For each different size of half-square triangles, the papers tell you the width to cut the fabric. The length is determined by the amount of paper you're using. In this case, these are 1-inch finished half-square triangles, and the cut width is 7 3/4 inches. Layer the 2 fabrics right sides together, pin the paper and fabrics together, sew in the direction of the arrows along the dashed lines. Once sewing is complete, cut along all the solid lines. Remove the papers, press the seams, and cut off the nubs. And finally, the last method I'm going to talk about to make half-square triangles is using the AccuQuilt cutting system. Years ago, when I bought my very first AccuQuilt cutting machine, it was the smallest machine. Back then they called it the Go Baby, but now they call it the Go Me, and it will fit anything that is 6 inches wide. When you purchase the Go Me cutter, it comes with a 3-inch finished half-square triangle die and the 3-inch finished quarter-square triangle die. And when I first bought my machine, it was just to do half-square triangles. If you look at this, you see the same concept of the square. The only difference is AccuQuilt cuts off the points, so you don't have any nubs to cut off. And the AccuQuilt dies work in the same way as what we have been looking at, where you start with a square. So if I wanted to make 2 half-square triangles, 2 at a time, I'd do the same thing. I'd put 1 layer of the dark fabric and another layer of the light fabric. I've run this through the machine, so I get the static off, take this excess off here, and I have my 2 half-square triangles. And if you lay these like this with the right sides together, you can simply pick them up off the mat and sew your 1/4-inch seam allowance. And then you'll have your 2 half-square triangles. And the good thing about this is you can layer up to 6 layers of fabric. So you would get 6 half-square triangles at a time. They make these dies in, I think the last time I checked, I wanted to see how many half-square triangle dies that they had available. And I want to say it was right around 15 or 20. I can't remember now how many, but there's a lot. They have different sizes. They'll have multiples where you can cut 4 patches at once. And if you layer 6 layers times 4 patches is 24 patches. So you can get 12 half-square triangles in one swoop off of those. And most all of them fit in the Go Me, the smaller machine. If you have been thinking about getting a AccuQuilt system, you might want to try the Go Me and try your 3-inch finished half-square triangles and quarter-square triangles and see how you like it. That's it for half-square triangles. For all of the other tutorials that are coming up, I'm going to incorporate them with quilts. It's easier for me to make just one video each week if I'm going to include a quilt. And I think most people are interested in making the quilts with the techniques they've learned. Coming up on this Friday, I'll have the pineapple block made with paper piecing and with the Creative Grids pineapple trim tool. Last week we had the AccuQuilt pineapple, and this week we'll have something for the rotary cutting people. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you on Friday. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and while you're at it, click the bell to be notified of future videos.